one of the things I just wanted to start with was by reminding you that the federal government is claiming at this point that in completing their 8 rounds of negotiations about CETA, that they've made significant progress in key areas. And what they call key areas, from my perspective as a city councillor, are in fact areas of great danger. They talk about looking at goods and services and investments and government procurement, and all of these are pieces in the municipal realm which are absolutely key to our ability to make good decisions in public policy. And so it is quite nerve-wracking to imagine that this particular piece of legislation could come forward and really significantly undermine the ability of local decision makers to make the right decisions for their residents and citizens from a good public policy perspective. So when Stephen Harper says that his government is resisting protectionist pressures and seeking ambitious outcomes, and has an agenda that says that this is going to be done next year sometime, I think that what I would like to suggest is that, in fact, this is not an agenda, as Stephen Harper suggests, that is Canada's goal, but in fact, this is Stephen Harper's goal. I don't share this goal. I don't think many municipal politicians would, and I'm sure that the bulk of the people in this room certainly don't share it either. The interesting thing for me about this is that as this has become more and more public, which certainly it hasn't been very public for the length of its negotiation period, municipal organizations and their professional associations have begun to really speak out against it. And you'll know, of course, that the Union of BC Municipalities last year did in fact pass a resolution opposing CETA and talking specifically to some recommendations that it's going to make, that it made, that I'm going to speak about in a little bit later. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities did follow suit, but with a less bold, if I might say, resolution. And in a little while, I'm going to talk a bit more about, I guess, the reservations and concerns I have about the Federation's resolutions, because I don't feel personally that they have provided enough clarity or enough of a toolbox for us to use to slow this down at the very least, if not stop it altogether. So UBCM and FCM raised a couple of very specific issues for the municipalities to worry about when you start talking about CETA. And I want to talk briefly about those. The first, obviously the most important from my perspective with the work that I've done, is about water. Water is just not for sale. It's not something that can be on the table anywhere, and it's just really quite shocking to imagine that any negotiating government, it is absolutely shocking to think that any negotiating government acting on behalf of its citizens should suggest at any level that that should be a point of discussion. It's really almost beyond comprehension that someone should imagine that water should be a commodity that could be sold or dealt in a way where private hands could have the leading decision-making capacity on who gets it and how much you pay for it and where it's available and all that sort of thing. And so this is really quite an extraordinary idea that's coming forward from them, and one obviously that I think most cities would oppose quite profoundly because, of course, as you saw in the film, water is the primary public utility. It is a human right. It is a commodity, as it were, that everyone has a right to at any time around the world. And I'm proud, as Bharat mentioned earlier, that Victoria earlier in the summer did pass the Blue Communities Initiative, which brought us in line with Burnaby, the only other city in Canada, which did take this on. And so Victoria is already well positioned to be in the forefront of this part of the discussion because our council has unanimously endorsed the idea that the human right to water is an essential concept and that it cannot be on any trade table at any time. And so looking at it from that perspective, water is key from my thoughts on the types of decisions that can't be part of this from a municipal perspective. Another one, as was alluded to in the video, of course, is the ability for us to do our own procurement decisions. The cities have a really essential role to play in the decisions they make about what they buy and from whom they buy their goods. And when you have a situation where you have any kind of a large multinational or a foreign interest being put in a position where they could not only bid unfairly, I would argue, in a procurement process because of the enormous resources they have, but in potentially succeeding in that bidding process, be then in a position where they can develop relationships which would allow them to then move further into the process of procurement in trying to establish patterns and preferential agreements. This is, again, a situation which is just really quite unconscionable. Cities use their procurement processes not just to get the best deal for the stuff that they use to serve their citizens, but they also use them as economic development strategies and social development strategies where they make decisions around who they buy from and what they buy and on what terms they use them to help develop new industries and to support existing industries or to foster green industries. And this is not just about buying paper for your city photocopying machines. This is about looking at it from a strategic perspective where you can actually make a series of decisions and an overall planned process and use those decisions to support your own community. And the potential from this agreement to undermine that ability to provide foreign nationals and foreign international organizations to come in and really take a step into a local purchasing structure is really, again, something that I don't think anyone would support, and certainly I don't believe that the City of Victoria or many of my colleagues in our surrounding communities would support at all. Another thing for us, of course, is the issue that was alluded to already around being required in this new organization to defend your procurement strategies. And in fact, the potential there, as has been suggested, is for us even to be required to pay back corporations who appeal decisions that are made based on good public policy on a local level, but which can be assailed under the CETA rules to suggest that unsuccessful international corporations would in fact expect some kind of compensation for not being selected. This has the potential to layer enormous administrative costs on municipalities, not just from the perspective of creating new systems so that they can prove and provide evidence that their systems were fair and abided by the terms of CETA, but also that they would be put in the position of having to defend legal or administrative tribunal appeals, which obviously is going to layer more and more costs of administrative and legal defense funds. So altogether, when you start looking at the issues of the loss of rights around water, you start looking at the issues of undermining procurement policies, which are, in Canada, almost $100 billion is what's traded amongst the municipalities in procurement purchasing. It is a massive, massive piece of our ability to create good public policy and to succeed. And so the last piece for me that's the most troubling, I guess, even though all of those very substantive pieces should be enough. The piece for me that has been the most troubling at all is that all of this has happened in a closet. This has really only come to the fore in the last few months when people like Barry and Maud and their allies have come to say, hey, don't forget, this is happening back here and we should be paying attention. And really, UBCM and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities have only jumped on this in the last year or so. And it's been a real struggle, I think, for forums like this to have an opportunity to get the word out to say this is a massive undertaking which has the potential to seriously shift the power structure in Canada. And from a municipal perspective, it has substantive inroads which will change the way we can make decisions on behalf of our residents. And it's all been done without any significant input from municipal leaders or their residents. We've had some discussions at some of our professional associations which have produced resolutions which have been put forward, which have been ignored. But there has been no real significant opportunity to have consultation or conversation or debate about what this needs to look like in order to support the right of municipalities to make good local public policy decisions on behalf of their local residents. So for me, although the substantive issues are significant, obviously, I think I am most troubled by the fact that all of this has been done in a way which has really allowed the federal government to completely sideline the rights of municipalities and the people that they serve. Now, the one thing I just wanted to mention before I conclude is that I do think it's important to state that the UBCM resolution was very clear, and I'll speak to it at the end, but the Federation of Canadian Municipalities took a slightly different road this year, and they tried to, I guess what you would call high road it, and look at it from the perspective of saying, okay, this is going to happen, and there's not a great deal we can do to actually stop it, so what we want to try and do is influence it in a way. And so they proposed a series of principles to try and guide, I guess, the balance of the negotiating processes. And the principles were good. They were around better municipal engagement and more transparency and having fairness at the negotiating table and including some reciprocity when you're talking about who can bid on what contracts, whether it's overseas or internally, which is all great stuff. And the federal government apparently agreed with it because they wrote a letter to FCM saying, that's a great idea. But the reality is that those principles have no definition and there's no measurement attached to them. And there's no ability to really define what that will look like in order to assess whether it's successful or whether it's been integrally included at all. As usual, I might say, it's been a federal government promise with this particular government that there is no way for us to account There's nowhere for us to call them into account or to say, you said you were going to do this and you didn't. So although it's great on paper, it doesn't really have any substance to it. And so I have to confess, as a municipal councillor, I was disappointed in the position of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities because I didn't feel it went as far as the provincial organization did. And what the provincial organization did was be very clear around its direction. I prefer the provincial position because I have to say I don't have a great deal of confidence in believing that the federal government is a great advocate on behalf of municipalities. I don't think they have been in the past, and I don't expect that to change. So what I want to encourage you to do is to make sure, as the video said, that you take this on as a personal issue, that you use every avenue open to you through your MPs who are here, through your city councillors who are here from the various jurisdictions. I see Judy Branoff up there. And all of the people that you know in your community who have some kind of influence, because this is the only way, as Maud said in the video, that we can actually make this happen. The Government of Canada has no reason to stop. It has stated its preferences, it has laid out its negotiating strategy, it has done everything it needs to do to get to this point, and there is no reason for them to turn away from this particular road unless we say no. And so I just want to close by saying, I'm not by nature a risk-averse individual, but I really do think that this particular agreement is exposing municipalities unnecessarily and overtly to a significant undermining of our ability to make decisions on behalf of our local residents. It too easily fosters a very vague sense of what the government is doing. It doesn't give any measurement tools to determine whether or not we're, quote, succeeding. It opens up all of our local procurement strategies for foreign investors and foreign bidders. It doesn't allow us to say no very easily at all. It exposes us to a place where we may have to respond to administrative and legal challenges. It completely undermines the basic right of a municipality to decide its own policy decisions for its residents. And so I think that what is missing here is a federal government process which respects municipalities, which listens to municipalities, which includes municipalities. And I think for me, the best way to conclude is to just refer to the original UBCM resolution from last year, and that is to say that what municipalities deserve and are asking for and expect is that the province intervenes, because the province can speak in our behalf with the federal government as better equals than we can, and that we demand a share at the table, a briefing of what's going on, a sector-by-sector analysis of what the effects of this will be on municipalities and the residents that they serve. And we in particular want the province to go to the wall with the federal government and ask for a very clear exclusion for municipalities from the terms of this agreement. No one has yet been able to answer the question for me, what is the harm to the agreement? Even if you believe in the agreement, which I don't, but even if you did, explain to me the harm that is done to it by taking municipalities out of the picture. There isn't any. And so from the selfish perspective of being a municipal politician at this moment, I have to argue for the absolute need for municipalities to be excluded from this agreement so that they continue to have the right to make good local decisions on behalf of their local people. And I will just stop by saying that it is my intention to introduce that motion to my council at the next available council meeting. So I hope that you'll come out and support that. Thank you very much.
It's like an old movie. This whole thing is like an old movie. And I'm sure that you've taken some time tonight. We need to spend more time talking to communities about what's really happening. And as I said just a moment ago, people are very busy. And they don't often have the time necessary to go through chapters and chapters, hundreds and thousands of pages of things that are supposed to be negotiated in our best interest. Now, I'm just going to do a poll in this room to see how close I am. How many have read the NAFTA agreement from cover to cover? Put your hands up. Okay, what about Tilma? Remember Tilma? Well, see, you've just indicated how much of a life you don't have if you're reading that kind of documents. And now we have, of course, CETA, which is kind of Tilma and NAFTA on steroids. It really takes care of all of the kinds of things that NAFTA and TILMA and others couldn't achieve. And Miriam talked a little bit about water and how important that is, and certainly for me, I spoke to someone tonight about when we started doing water campaigns, and we didn't know the date, but she knew it was before my motorcycle accident. Thanks for bringing that back to me, but that's prior to 2003. You know, this struggle has been going on for a very long time, but as you can see in the media, there really is a swell of people that are angry. Occupy Vancouver, Occupy places in Canada, is people are really starting to understand that's what's happening at the table. Good, good. Is really not doing anything for communities. And I say that because I must admit that in any presentation that I do, I don't start out by talking about how important it is to be global, global, global on everything. And of course, if you don't start out a presentation these days with that, it's a sacrilege. You know, we have to understand, as Maud and I were driving up here, talking about, you know, the impact that we can have. And the impact we can have in Ottawa as a result of us doing things in our community, in fact, in our neighborhood, is significant. Because we know, and as I said on many occasions, although politicians may not be able to read, they can count. And that's important, I think. Seriously, I am the biggest fan of local governments because I really think that we can do things where we feel comfortable much better. And the other part of that with working with local governments to try to get at this through provincial and more centralized governments is there's no place for them to hide. You're going to see them at the grocery store, at the ice rink, at a meeting at the school district. You're going to see them all the time. And you can bet if you make a bad decision as a councillor or a school trustee, you're going to hear about it real fast because there's no plane for you to Victoria or Ottawa. So I think we have to use that. You know, I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination. More am I a trade negotiator. I've done some negotiations, some good, some bad, some worse. But I don't pretend to know what really happens in trade agreements. But there's one common denominator for me that I see in all trade agreements, whether it be NAFTA or TILMA or CETA. It's always about that word trade. You know, they've kind of stolen the language. My upbringing told me that trade meant you gave something to somebody and you got back something of equal value. And if anybody can tell me what I got or my family got or just my neighborhood got, never mind what our country or our province or our community at large might have had, I would be satisfied. But what's happening here is just the opposite. We are selling off to multinationals, nationals, the ability for young people, the next generation, to even have an opportunity that we have. You know, I talk often about partnership deals, and really it's the same. It all comes back to the middle. And Miriam talked a little bit about procurement and how that impacts us. I always tell people when I speak to them about procurement and those kinds of things that happen in our province that young people are getting angry. And they're getting angry because my generation, and I'll take full responsibility for this, my generation has told them that they are our future. And you know what? They're getting tired of that. I have 4 children and 4 grandchildren, and they're getting tired of it. Because they don't believe that my generation has decided that they would sell off a core service in their community, a school, a hospital, a rec center, any other infrastructure that's important to communities, that they would sell that off and not have any ability to have any say in that major infrastructure in their community from the day they go to work until the day they retire. 30-year agreements. The working life of young people will not have any ability to say what is good or new or what needs to change in their infrastructure as a result of somebody in France owning it. That's simply not going to work very much longer. Somebody talked about a little bit, I guess, probably didn't put it this way, but democratization and really taking away our right not only to think, but our right to have an opinion. You know, I was talking to Maud about, shouldn't there be another meeting like this somewhere else with the federal government telling us what is good in this deal for us and what's wrong with this deal and how we can make it better and what our provincial government has currently on the table and whether or not we agree with that? Isn't that the minimum that democracy demands? You know, this really gets in the way of a lot of things that I think we're trying to do. And CUPE members will know that next week in Prince George, I'm going to do the hard launch of what we're calling the 10% shift. Write it down, 10%shift.ca. And what it really is us standing up and saying we're going to do more. We're going to do more for people. We don't need multinationals. We need to have procurement models that help our community, that recognize small business, that recognize our families as one. Now, some of you who might be my age, 37, will remember when you were growing up. When you were growing up, it was a lot different. You know, I did a tour about 14 months ago of 38 communities, mostly rural British Columbia, and talked to people, chambers of commerce, not ones that usually invite me in for dinner, talk to them about what really needs to happen. And a couple of things came to me. As I spoke in the Cowichan Valley, I talked to the president of the Commerce, a third-generation agribusiness farmer, and he told me that just 18 years ago, when they sold the farm, or he took possession of it, that 87% of all poultry, meat, dairy products, 87% was raised or grown in the Cowichan Valley. That's 14% now. You know, when we start to think about those things and what we could do, the whole local food thing is very, very important. But when you think about procurement, why in fact is it that because of any trade deal, that we aren't giving a company or a small business or a medium-sized business in our community the ability to bid on some of these contracts at least 10% so that they get a leg up? It's healthier, it's better for the environment, and guess what? It gives us an opportunity to encourage young people to stay where they are. And we're not doing that. And the reason we can't is people say we have to, if we do that, we're going to end up in Geneva for a trade panel, and we're all going to hell. It'll be the end of it. Well, you know what? The free market capital of the planet to our south gives 16 counties, 31 of the largest cities, between 8 and 14% uplift for local companies to do procurement in their own community. We got to start doing that. We have got to start doing that, my friends. This is not new. And we're not trying to stop anything. We are trying to start something new. And that's important. It's important for us as a society. It's important certainly to the next generation of workers and the generation following them. And you know what? I just think people are fired up enough to just start asking questions. Start talking to their neighbors, not talking in all town hall meetings, but talking across the fence with a glass of wine or a cup of coffee and say, did you hear what this was all about? You know, it sounds like a huge problem, CETA. That's what they want you to think, that we can't boil it down. Well, remember what Margaret Mead said. She said, don't think for 1 minute that you can't make a difference. In fact, that's what always has. Thank you very much.
Now, why has CETA not already been bubbling up all over the place? Well, there are two reasons, in my opinion. The first is that the Harper government is very different than other governments before them, and they know that it's best if people don't know what's in these trade agreements, because when Canadians find out what's in them, they don't like them. And we have a whole history of trade agreements that we have rejected. Some the government's passed anyway, but we have won the hearts and minds of the majority of Canadians whenever we have had these debates. So Harper has just put this under the wire. It's just negotiators quietly negotiating. They've been aided and abetted by a pretty conservative mainstream media here in Canada, I'd have to say, including the CBC, that has just treated this as if it's the next step of a natural evolution. And we're not getting, it's much, much harder to get space, to get our position in the mainstream media. And I compare this to Brian Mulroney, who when the first thing he did when he was elected in 1984 was go down to the United States and speak to New York to a blue chip business audience, and the title was Canada Open for Business. And they took out a 9-page glossy color supplement in the local New York Times. I still have it, it's a collector's item, and basically it just laid out the agenda, the end of the Foreign Investment Review Agency, the end of Canadian control over our energy. I mean, it's just all there, the whole agenda as it unfolded. And Brian Mulroney used to say, give me 20 years and you won't recognize this country. Yeah. Stephen Harper doesn't do that. So it's been much harder to get the information. It's not just what Mary said when she spoke, which is that there's a cone of silence around the negotiation. There's not even a discussion of the concept. That's one reason. I think the other reason is that many, many Canadians, and I would have included myself among them, think that Europe's cool. Europe has better environmental agreements, better trade agreements, and the idea is, isn't it better to diversify away from the United States? And wouldn't a trade agreement with a more progressive part of the world be a good thing? And that's the other argument that we need to face, because that has proven very difficult for us, even with progressive people who think it must be a good thing. So here's the story with Europe. First of all, it's the same business interests that were behind NAFTA and every other agreement. Some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies, and by the way, we're moving to a patent regime to match the tougher patent regime protections of Europe, which is going to raise drug prices in this country by about $3 billion. Many, many of the big pharmaceuticals companies are from Europe. Many of the big food services corporations are from Europe. The two biggest water corporations in the world are from Europe. The biggest bottled water company, Nestle, is from Europe. These companies want the right to be able to come into our communities and lock in access to public contracts, public procurement, which is why provinces are at the table for the very first time. They got in this agreement what they never got in NAFTA. NAFTA did not touch what's called subnational procurement. It didn't move to the provinces and municipalities, nor did the WTO. But this time they're going to, and they're going to have access to the mother lode. And you should know that under NAFTA, a clause called the most favored nation, Canada, none of the NAFTA countries can make an agreement with a new set of countries or a new country giving more access to those corporations and not giving them to NAFTA. So whatever, the American companies under NAFTA. So whatever we open up at the provincial and municipal level under procurement with CETA, we have to give to American corporations. So it's like reopening NAFTA to finish what they didn't get in the first round, which puts our health care, childcare, public services at all levels in jeopardy. So I really cannot say this strongly enough. This is a business deal, like all of the trade agreements, started by the business community, for the business community, and that's the only sector that's going, the big business community, that's going to gain from this. The other thing you should know about Europe is that they are privatizing really, really, really fast. Part of the European Union was something called an agreement on procurement, which is the model for the CETA. The agreement on procurement basically says that all of the companies, the private sector of every country, must be able to move across borders of other countries as if there's no border. They must be granted status as if they're domestic companies. And to do that and to give them opportunities, each country has to agree to move to public-private partnerships in key sectors like transit, hydroelectricity, water. Now they're moving into social services, public services. They are privatizing very fast, and they're privatizing by law. Let me give you an example. 2 years ago, the government of Italy brought in a law saying that all municipalities had to come up with a plan to move to public-private partnerships for water delivery, water services. There was such an outcry in Italy that the people forced a plebiscite on this issue, and last year won this overwhelmingly. The majority, vast majority of Italians voted to bring their water back into public services. Last week, the Central Bank of Europe put out a directive to the Italian government that got leaked. And basically what it said was, it doesn't matter what the people think. We are telling you, because this is what you need to do to get relief, on your debt. You have to privatize the following services, and water was one of them. So it doesn't matter what the people want. And this is the model of procurement that is the basis for CETA, and this is what people need to know. So when you think about Europe, that's a nostalgic vision that Europe, of course there's still there are wonderful people in Europe, and of course there's still very strong standards that they want around food and so on, but the agreement, for instance, on food, is that Canada will give up its supply management so for dairy, wheat, the wheat board and so on, in exchange for Europe lowering those standards against GE imports and against our hormone-laced beef. And this isn't me saying this. This is the government boasting that this is what the end game is. That we will give up this, but they will get, what our farmers will get will be to be able to dump our GE foods into Europe, because there has been such a movement against. So there is a very strong environmental and labor consciousness in Europe, but it is coming up against a very, very tough corporate agenda being imposed now by this new austerity measure. So it's important for people not to glorify or romanticize Europe. It's a big mistake to do that. This is an intrusion into the democratic process in our country by the European Union, which is seeking all sorts of new opportunities for their corporations. And don't forget, these public-private partnerships spawn big companies, which then are always wanting to go out into the world and grow. That's globalization. So we know that we're talking about public services now. We're also talking about a resource grab. Europe is in a race with China to get permanent access to raw resources. The world's running out of everything, as you well know. So they want access to our fish, potash, uranium, natural gas, forest, coal, nickel, you name it. And the way they get it is through this investor state. Investor state is the ability of a corporation from another country using the trade agreement to sue the government of another country, the country they're operating in, if that government imposes any rules that they can argue now mean that they have to, lose profits, or the investment opportunities weren't what they thought. And so they would have the right to say, once they have this access to these raw resources, including fish, by the way, they want the quotas, the rule that the quota should be only for Canadians, they want that gone. They want to be able to process the fish offshore. They want more access to our fisheries, as if they're not in trouble enough. But they want it in perpetuity. And this is the thing you need to understand. This investor state gives corporations the right to say, once we have access, we have permanent access. Let me give you an example. Abitibi-Bowater is an American corporation that, a pulp and paper that operated for many years in Newfoundland. And they had access to timber and water rights as long as they created jobs. And that was an agreement they had. 4 years ago, they left Newfoundland on their own. They weren't kicked out. And they turned around and they said to the Newfoundland government, we now want compensation for the water and timber rights we left behind. And Danny Williams was the premier then, and he basically told them what they could do with that little constant, as only Danny Williams could. So they launched a Chapter 11 challenge under NAFTA against the federal government, because you have to launch it against the federal government because they're who signed the agreement. Not only did Stephen Harper not go to bat for Newfoundland, not only did he not take this to a NAFTA panel and fight for Newfoundland, they turned around and gave the company $130 million think of what that money would have done for the workers and their pensions, the workers that were left without jobs and pensions. To prove that he's the Boy Scout of these trade agreements, setting a precedent where any corporation at this moment from NAFTA, but if CETA is signed, any corporation from Europe operating in Canada using our water can now claim to own the water, physically, literally own the water. That means all the big American energy companies operating in the tar sands. That means any big American or European food company using water to grow biofuels or whatever the heck they're growing and exporting, they could now claim to own the water. So this is how the transfer happens from people at a step at a time, from people to these corporations through trade agreements that become like a new constitutional law, taking precedence over domestic law. And I think that one of these tactics that we need to think about is working really closely with First Nations people in our country and around the world, and we're already doing this, because I believe that if push comes to shove, these treaties will take precedence over land claims. But we also know that where there are intrusions in our world, they are intrusions into First Nations communities and tribal communities in India. Coca-Cola comes in and just helps themselves to their water. I just got back from Guatemala fighting a horrible company called Goldcorp, which is from Vancouver. Canadian mining companies are the worst in the world. We run most of the mines in the world. You may not know this. We are on record, and this is a study from the resource industry itself, the worst violators in terms of the environment and human rights abuses. In this case, they run a mine called the Marlin Mine. It's a gold mine. They use cyanide leaching to separate the gold from the ore, and the whole community's getting sick. The kids are coming to school with their arms all covered in welts and stomach aches, and cancer rates are up in the community. There have been many independent studies that have come in and said the water table is being destroyed. If you stand up against them, you stand a chance of being shot in the face, as a woman I met was. She wouldn't sell her little plot of land where she grows a little food and has goats and chickens and so on, you know, or being threatened, or your children being threatened at school. These rights get locked in these kind of agreements, and it's usually Indigenous peoples around the world who are facing this kind of theft of their resources, theft of their water, and so on. And I think that we need to work very, very closely to say, you know, we will resist. But one of the ways of resistance is a lot of this stuff has to go across First Nations unceded land. And it's a tactic that I think is incredibly important. On water, I just want to say a couple of things, and then we want to have a discussion with you rather than at you too much longer. But these two companies, Veolia and Suez, are the two biggest service companies in the world. In the global south, they are operating in many, many communities because the World Bank comes into a poor community and says, or a country, says if you want funding for water services, you have to take these companies. And we'll do the deal, and it's public money that will pay them. And so the World Bank invests in this project, but gives the returns to the private company. It's done on a for-profit basis. It's called full cost recovery. So of course, they just turn the water off to anybody, or don't deliver it in the first place to anyone who cannot pay. The first of the water wars that we talk about was in Cochabamba, Bolivia in the late 1990s. When Bechtel came in, wasn't even a water company, it was an engineering company. First thing they did was triple the price of water. And then they said, we even own the water coming from the rain and the sky. And if you capture it in buckets or cisterns or whatever, you have to pay us because that's our water. And the people said, I don't think so. And there was an uprising, and there were people killed. The army was brought in. It wasn't the current prime minister or president. But the company did have to leave, and they sued under one of these investor-state agreements, by the way, for many millions of dollars, and they technically won, but it was so unpopular that they ended up paying they only asked the Bolivian government for $1 in the end, because we had made it so hot for them around the world, and this is the power of our movement being able to do this. In the global north, what these companies are doing is coming into communities like Abbotsford, where we were 2 nights ago, and saying to cash-strapped communities, we've got cash to invest in your upgrading, your infrastructure, or you need to literally, service a whole bunch of new people, so we've got the money to do this. And then the Harper government turns around and has said, and we will give money, we will give you federal money, but only if you do a public-private partnership. So you get the public, you get the federal government saying, here's the deal for money from us. You get the provincial government doing much of the same, and then you get the private company coming in and saying, and we will offer money. And it's tempting, and thank God Victoria didn't do this, but it's very tempting for a cash-strapped municipal government to go for that easy money. What they're forgetting is that once that company gets its investment back, it will then be able to make profits for years and years and years and years and years. And they also make decisions about who gets water, how much the water is going to cost, where they're going to put money into infrastructure and so on. The profit goes back to investors, does not get put back into the community, doesn't get put back into protecting source water and so on. So it's a deal with the devil. And even if they're honest, and most of them aren't, but even if they're honest, they still have to make a profit from water. And if you think that water is being turned off to people in the global south alone, think again. Inner city Detroit has cut the water to 45,000 families officially, although the community there tells me they think the number is double. Mostly African Americans, single mothers, elderly people literally don't have water coming out of their taps. They have to go to local parks or local schools and bring their buckets. And I mean, it is the third world come to the first world, just as the first world has come to the third world with this class structure that we're now seeing. So we need to stand up and say no to this agreement. And I think it'd be really wonderful to win this one. It's not going to be easy over the next 4 years. I mean, Stephen Harper did not get the blessing of a majority from the Canadian people, but he is acting as if he did. And I thought when Bridget DePape, the little Senate page, stood up in the House of Commons that day, yes, and held up her Stop Harper sign. And then she went on television that night and she said, what we have to do for the next 4 years is resist everything they do. I thought, there we are. There's our marching orders for the next 4 years. It couldn't be much clearer. There will be some that will be hard to win, and there will be some that we can win. And this CETA is something that we can win, not because we're going to get the Harper government to change its mind, but here's what I think. I met with the European ambassadors to Canada. They invited me, and it was quite funny. The EU ambassador himself, a guy named Brinkman from Germany, said, we were told, because it was Canada who initiated this whole thing, it wasn't Europe. He said, we were told by the Canadian government that there would be no opposition to this agreement. I said, really? Really? Isn't that an interesting thing? And how could they guarantee that? Well, that's what they were told. They don't like opposition. And I think if we can get enough opposition from farmers and from faith-based groups and from artists and from, justice people and from working people and from all of us, from seniors, we've done this before. We did it with the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. It was just as obscure. It was just as advanced when we found out about it. I heard about this from Martin Corr, a wonderful man with the Third World Network. And I came back and I phoned the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. I phoned the minister's office, and they said there was no such thing. Not even a month later, we got the MAI in a brown paper bag, and we did an analysis, gave it to the Globe and Mail, front page of the Globe and Mail, out there it was. And oops, didn't the government suddenly discover that after all there was an MAI? Where had they put it? They just hadn't put it somewhere. Then they came up with a website and then touted it as the best thing since sliced bread. a few months later, under access to information, we got files that showed that they had been meeting with the business community for 3 years. You know, and I remember when I talked to the minister's aide, he said, "Oh, Maude, you and your conspiracy theories." As we mobilized, and we can do it again. They cannot force this through if the people of Canada say no. And so it is really a very important, there are many important issues for us to work on, but if we don't stop the escalation of this transfer of power of corporations to this level, then it makes everything else that we're going to be doing very, very difficult. So I just want to end by saying to you that I know I've fought many fights in my life, and it's a mug's game to think that you're going to win them all. You know, often you can look at something by saying, well, did we build a movement? Do we know more than we did? You know, what did we learn? Did we come together? Did we stay together? Did we stay for the next struggle? And if the answer is yes, then you know, then that was a win in and of itself. But we need to put together a resistance in this country, and we need to define ourselves and redefine ourselves as stewards of what others sacrifice to give us, public health care and you know, social programs and parks and libraries and the CBC, even though I get mad at the CBC as we all do. But I mean, this is a heritage that was given to us, and it is our responsibility to see ourselves as stewards. Thank you very much.
First of all, the question around whether or not the labor movement is responding in the way they should. And there's lots of views on that, right? And I think that no one other than me, I'm not the best liked labor leader amongst labor leaders, at least. Of course, I know all you love me, but seriously, I think that, you know, we're learning too. We really are learning too, and our members have come away from when I grew up as an activist in the labor movement. It was a lot different. That generation of leaders kind of taught me not how to talk, but how to be quiet. And so I think that we're going through the same kind of change or transition as everyone else is. I think, though, that we can be encouraged, because I certainly am in the number of places that I speak around young leaders, and they're very bright, very aggressive, and very energetic. So that for me is a good thing. I don't say that just because I feel that way. I was involved, as many of you will know, and I don't think that this struggle has at all stopped. But I think that the work that the Canadian Labour Congress did on the whole issue of CPP and pensions really brought them back into the forefront. Not only from a point of view of trade unionists or union members across the country, but I think the public started to understand that, you know, this is what we really want a major organization to do that not only represents workers, unionized workers, but represents the kind of society that they all want. So I think that's a positive step forward. And I think that from my organization's point of view, that rallies are really great. You can well imagine I've done the few from the top of a pickup truck in my 35 years. But let me tell you, we need more than the labor movement or the union, if that's what it is. Our union is simply a snapshot of what communities look like. And probably if you took a poll amongst our members on where they live, and you took a poll of non-CUPE members, you'd probably come up with the very same answer. They want to make a decent living. They want their children to stay there. They want the community to thrive. For one reason, and let me stop this long answer on that. Contrary to what people think or what the mainstream media might say, this community and Prince Rupert and Lanceville, heaven forbid, and Port Hardy, and all of those places truly are the real engine of the economy that we keep hearing about. Wall Street or Howe Street never put shelter over anybody's head or put dinner on anybody's table. It's the engine of the economy that you need to understand. So don't believe for 1 minute, although it could be the Congress, it could be CUPE, any other member, don't believe in TINA. Don't believe that there is no other alternative, because there is. And my parents and my grandparents proved it. And I am, I think, willing to go, advised by them, that we can do it too. But we're just, if you don't own the media, you can't get what you want out. You need to own it. And if you look who's owning it right now, it's not positive, but we can get through that.
The questions, just no particular order, well, some particular order. The question about First Nations, yes, we are working with the Assembly of First Nations and a number of the provincial assemblies and just individual First Nations communities, particularly since we did get the right to water finally recognized at the United Nations. And so we're thinking that the test case in Canada, because every country is now obliged, whether they supported it or not, and Canada did not and still does not, they still are obliged to implement a program to ensure that this right in their own country and in our country, the disgraces in First Nations communities. So there's a lot to be done, and anyone who has thoughts and ideas and connections about that, please help us to make that happen. The question about, is it possible they're holding off here in Victoria until CETA is signed? I never thought of it, but I put nothing past them. And certainly, if CETA is signed, it's going to make it much, much harder to turn down a privatization, because not only will a private company like Veolia and Suez have the right to come in when something is privatized and opened up for bidding, they come in with a better bid because they're bigger. But we even think they're going to be able to challenge local assertions of maintaining public control over water. They're going to be able to come in and say, but that in itself is a barrier to trade. So very big concern there. Two questions about Occupy Victoria, and just generally. So I wanted to lump those together. Yes, the council's very involved in the Occupy Victoria, Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, Halifax, Ottawa. We're very, very connected. But this is really what's lovely about this movement, is that it's flat. They don't want leaders. The idea is that it's to come off the ground. And so that leads to the other question on the Occupy movement, and that there's no unified message. That's the criticism. I think that's great. I think that's our strength. I think we need to say there's one no. We're saying no to the current system, but many yeses. There are many, many ways that we're going to come together, and through the richness of our varied experience, we're going to put up wonderful alternatives. And when the right-wing press says, oh, you people don't have one central clear message, they know perfectly well that that's just a jab. They see a power growing. They know that it's there. They know that there is a lot of unhappiness amongst youth who have done everything they were told to do and cannot get decent jobs and cannot buy into this dream that they were told was there. It was best said by a 15-year-old young woman at a high school event that I was at, where they were touting the big business community, and the kids all were wearing T-shirts with corporate logos on them, and their CEO, their principal called himself the CEO of the high school. I kid you not. And this young woman got up and she took her little finger and she pointed at her principal and the business people up in the panel, and she said, "Don't think we're stupid here." She said, "We know that you're playing musical chairs with our futures, and you don't plan to have enough chairs for all of us when the music stops." That's what she said. And I thought, I've never heard a better analysis of this. And by the way, just talking about the Council of Canadians, please, we'd like to get our chapter really revved again, and we really want we think that an activist chapter here, working with CUPE, working with Water Watch, working with all of the other wonderful groups, can really take CETA on. So please, anyone who's inclined to do something tonight after this, please join us and join the chapter in particular. CARP, yes, we should be getting to, this is Canadian Association of Retired People, we should be getting to Zoomer magazine, absolutely. Kathleen asked if all companies are seen as domestic, will that mean labor mobility? We don't know, but we think so. Again, we don't know all the details. We had an early leaked copy of the document, but the concerns that we have are very much in that area as well. And the question of the Privacy Act, how do you implement the Privacy Act when more and more is privatized, like our census and so on? Really powerful additional questions here. I really wanted to address the question Sandy raised on farmers and thank you for coming, the group of you. This is very much a concern of the National Farmers Union, and you can go to their website. It is brilliantly explained there. But not only are they talking about the fact that you can't save seed, but they're saying that even if you do, if they catch you with their GE product blown accidentally onto your farm, they can actually seize your farm, seize your bank account, seize your machinery, so that you can't make money while you're going to court to try to prove your innocence. It's a really draconian agreement. This is, and I just want to remind us that post-NAFTA, 80,000 family farms were shut down in this country. This became a real conduit for the big agribusiness companies to come in and take over. So thank you for raising that. It's an incredibly important one. Yes to the statement that was made that NGOs are more and more afraid to speak out. I mean, look at what the Harper government's doing to groups like Rights and Democracy, Kairos, you know, the Canadian Council on International Cooperation, all of the groups that received money from the federal government for many years that in any way do not espouse their agenda are being singled out. Glenn asked about contracts, how will it work? No, if a contract has been signed with a company, CETA will not force that contract to be broken, but every new procurement agreement that comes up, these European and American companies will have the right to come in and bid. And what you cannot do is you cannot favor the local. So if you're, for instance, a hospital or municipality or a school and you've brought in a program to support local food and local farmers, that will be not allowed. You won't be allowed to have a local bottled water ban because Nestle will come in. Nestle is chomping at the bit to get a CETA so that they can challenge all the bottled water bans and so on. So you cannot favor what Barry's trying to do, which is promoting the local economy, local self-sufficiency through local businesses, local food production, and so on. So that's the really, really interesting, important piece there. I want to thank the postal worker, the woman from the postal workers. CETA is very much, and I should have mentioned it, the Europeans are very much targeting our public postal services, which they see as a barrier to trade. And then just the last question was on how to get the word out, and somebody also mentioned weekly newsletters or newspaper. I don't think we have the capacity to put out a heavy print newspaper once a week. But what we are doing better and better and better all the time is social media, is getting our information up on the internet, is getting our information out through everything from Rabble to Huffington Post to you know, just direct listservs and so on. And I think this is the conundrum that newspapers are in. I spoke to a reporter last week and I said, you know, we need you to tell such and such a story. And she said, you want newspapers to tell your story? Start buying them again. Because the problem is, the more you guys don't buy newspapers, the more they lay us off, and the more beats each reporter has to cover, and the less we can cover of what you want. And I said, well, it's really a vicious circle, because we stopped buying your newspapers because you're not telling the stories we want. You're not writing about the stories we want to hear. And I remember a number of years ago, NDP voters were the biggest consumers of the Globe and Mail. That's no longer true, but there was a time, even though the Globe and Mail was conservative or neoliberal, whatever you want to call it, in terms of their editorial, they always gave the other side on the stories. They don't anymore. They don't come to any of us to give another side. The other side is somebody a little bit less on the right. There's the right, and then there's the not totally, completely as over at the right, and that's the opposition, right? And so we stop buying their newspapers, and it becomes a vicious circle. We are going to have to create our own methods of getting to each other. And just on the quote about Tommy Douglas, what he said was, fascism doesn't necessarily wear a brown shirt or a black shirt. Sometimes it wears a dress shirt.